University of Manchester. His major research focus is on modeling and simulation of flotation cells and circuits, with particular emphasis on the modeling of the froth phase. However, his simulation work has expanded to cover, in a general sense, most of the multi-phase processing. And in this regard, it includes comminution, packed beds, heap leaching, physical separation, and dry processing routes. He has authored more than 120 peer-reviewed papers in several journals, and he has worked very closely with the many industries, including Rio Tinto, Anglo-American, Metso, Weir, and many other companies that are in the mining business, as well as in supplying mining equipment. At Imperial College, he is actually the director for the Metals and Energy Finance MSc course, which is a very well-known course worldwide. And in this particular course, they do a lot of interesting things, focusing both on technical and financial evaluation of resource projects. I've known Stephen for many years, and we do a lot of research together, particularly on the modeling side. And I think I will look forward to a very nice seminar that he will give us today. It's a privilege to have you in the GCC seminar, Stephen. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aubrey, for the introduction. So what I'm going to be talking about today is partly an overview of some of the work I've been doing over, well, many years now, but also particularly looking at the sort of link between modeling and the measurements that go with the modeling. Admittedly, I am very much on the modeling side of that equation, so I will also be talking about some of the work being done by a variety of my colleagues here at Imperial College. Next slide. Okay, so first of all, this is where I'm actually sitting. So for those of you who don't know Imperial College, it's my building is that little one about there. And so in a very, very nice bit of West London. So again, I'm in what is historically the Royal School of Mines. So we have one of the few pretty looking buildings on the campus. Unfortunately, most of the campus is 1960s monstrosities, but the Royal School of Mines building is still a very nice one. And I am part of the Advanced Mineral Processing Research Group. We're a reasonably large research group that does work in a large number of different fields. So here, just giving you a few ideas of those fields, but I won't be talking about all of them. So overall, what I'm going to be talking about today, as I said, is an overview of the modeling and simulation work that we carry out in the Advanced Mineral Processing Research Group. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about how the sort of new modeling approaches are linked to our development of new measurement and analysis techniques to complement this work. So I know most people here are in the comminution side of things, and I apologize for starting on flotation, but flotation is very much my main or initial research area, though I have branched out into others. So I'm going to be starting from looking at froth flotation today. And of course, froth flotation is an interesting subject to study, mainly because it has so many things happening at such a wide variety of length scales. You have things happening from the sort of particle scales of tens to hundreds of microns, all the way up to the sort of cell scales of hundreds of cubic meters potentially. And so we really do need to understand what is happening at various scales to understand the overall behavior of these systems. And of course, it is quite hard to both predict and study. You know, it's multi-phase. We have all three phases in there having an important role. From a measurement perspective, it's challenging because it's opaque. You know, it has two distinct phases. It has a pulp zone and a froth phase with very different behaviors within those phases, which means that modeling it is complicated, and actually even more complicated probably is coupling the models between those phases for how they will end up working. So, as I said, overall, we're looking at both modeling in both of these phases. So looking at modeling in the froth phase and the pulp phase, looking at some of the experimental work we do in those, as well as the modeling that goes with it. And these two for us are intimately related. And we then end up looking at how we optimize the processes, etc. So to start with, I'm going to be looking at some of the work we've done on trying to understand the froth phase of flotation. And partly that was motivated by the fact that, well, first of all, it doesn't follow the nice, simple kinetic models, which are actually pretty good approximations for what's happening in the pulp zone of a flotation cell. And it's also a really important part of the cell for overall performance. It is largely determines how much entrainment you're going to get, and so is a massive factor in the grades you're going to achieve from the cell, and simultaneously impacting the overall recovery as well. So it's pretty much the key factor in that relationship between overall grade and recovery obtained from a flotation cell. So that was where we started our modeling. And I suppose what differentiates us from a lot of modeling that is done for minerals processing is our I suppose default way of trying to understand these systems is to look at mechanistic models. So to try and understand the physics of the system, build up our models from reasonably fundamental relationships, so from force balances, mass balances, etc., and use these as the basis for our modeling and simulation. So in our modeling of the froth phase, we do have models for how the air bubbles move. We have models for how the liquid moves. We have models for how the particles move within the system. But I suppose the most interesting of them is probably how the liquid moves in the system. And in terms of how the particles subsequently move, it's really the key factor in the particle motion as well, particularly the motion of the particles that are not attached to the bubbles. And you might think that that's only the gang, but actually by the time the froth is overflowing the lip of the cell, in most of the measurements we do, over 90% of the particles are no longer attached. So particles fall off the froth in the froth, but if you think about it, the water motion in a froth has to on average be upwards, and so particles, even if they fall off the bubbles, are not necessarily falling out of the froth overall. So the motion of the liquid is critically important to both the overall entrainment, but also to the recovery of particles in the froth. And the way you should think about a flotation froth, or any other foam or froth for that matter, is really as a network of pipes. These are the plateau borders. Capillary suction means that you end up with comparatively thin lamellae or films between the bubbles, and most of your liquid is in these plateau borders. So the junctions where three films meet, and these form a continuous network of channels through the froth. And so it's the liquid flow down these channels which determines the behavior, the overall liquid motion in a froth. The amount of liquid in your films is tiny in comparison. And there are basically three forces which influence the behavior of the liquid. There's viscous dissipation. Your bubbles are moving upwards quicker than your liquids. Your liquid's draining downwards relative to the bubbles, and the viscous forces slowing that drainage down. There's capillary suction. I said you should think of this as sort of like a pipe network, but these are pipes that change size. And so as the liquid content drops, the curvature gets sharper, and so the capillary suction gets higher. So liquid gets sucked from regions of large plateau borders, so high liquid content regions, towards regions with small liquid content. And of course, overall gravity is the other dominant force. And so once you combine all of these three forces, you get what's known as the foam drainage equation. And so this equation is really fundamental to our predictions of the foam behavior. And we use this to produce CFD-like models of the froth phase of flotation. So as I said, we produce models for the gas motion, we have models for the liquid motion, and then we have models for the particle motion on top of that, looking at settling, dispersion, etc. for the particles. And so this was a lot of the early work that I did, was in developing these sorts of froth phase models. And we've used them for a number of different purposes. One of the early ones we looked at was actually looking at what would be the effect of different types of launder design layouts. And it's quite often for very large cells to have internal launders to try and reduce the distance that the froth has to actually flow to get into the launders. And two common types of designs are either to have what's known as a donut launder. Basically, you're having your froth crowded either from the outer wall of the cell or from the inside of the cell towards a central launder, or you have ring launder. So essentially, here the froth is crowded outwards in both halves of the cell. And actually, surprisingly, we found the behavior actually quite different between these two different types of launders. And even in the same cell, the two halves of your froth zone are actually behaving differently. So this is the center line of the tank, and you're actually achieving higher grades, according to our simulations, in the region where it's been pushed outwards compared to when you have a donut launder and pushing the froth inwards. And we mentioned this to our, well, it's actually Anglo Platinum at the time, and they had cells with these sorts of launders, and so they decided to actually go and see if this was the case, to try and, I suppose, gain confidence in the ability of these models to do these predictions. And that is exactly what they found. Note that these aren't simulations for exactly the same conditions. We basically did the simulations first for a generic froth, and they then went and tested it in their cells, and they did indeed find that the grade in the inner section as you went down was higher than the grades in the outer section, just as we had predicted in our modeling, which gave us at least confidence that the modeling is actually telling us something about how these cells are actually behaving. And from there, we went on to simulate different types of launder layouts. So those first simulations were only in 2D. We now do 3D simulations of the froth phase so that we can do more complex launder designs where you don't just have symmetric launders, but you also have things like radial launders, etc. And we can predict the performance of the froth in this. These simulations, though, are typically coupled to relatively simple models for what's happening in the froth. So we tend to couple these models just to first-order rate kinetic models for the behavior in the froth. In the pulp. But one of the key things we found when actually trying to do these simulations is we needed a boundary condition. We needed to know how much air was bursting at the surface relative to how much air was actually flowing out of the cell as unburst bubbles, as this was a key parameter in all the simulations and modeling we were doing. But when we actually first started doing this, nobody was actually measuring this on any plants. Nobody knew what an appropriate number actually was. And so we decided to actually start measuring it ourselves, and we quantified this by something called an air recovery. So the air recovery is simply the fraction of air that you put into the cell that actually ends up overflowing the lip rather than bursting. And I'll talk a little bit about how we measure it, but actually this is one of those cases where even without the modeling itself, just knowing that this was actually important led us to some quite interesting discoveries. Firstly, our modeling at that stage hadn't yet got to the point of being able to accurately predict the stability of these froths. The stability is a very hard thing to predict in flotation. It comes down to, bubble loading, surfactants, all sorts of factors go into the actual stability and therefore goes into the air recovery itself. And so actually air recovery is one of the things in these models that became an empirical input. And to provide these inputs, we therefore wanted to actually go out and measure it. And an interesting thing that was found, not by myself, but by other members of the group after we discovered that air recovery was an important parameter, was actually that as you increase your air rate into a flotation cell, we actually go through a peak in air recovery. So initially, as you increase your air rate, the amount of air amount bursting is going up slower than the amount that is being added. And so you actually increase the fraction of your air that is going over the lip. Eventually, though, as you add more and more air, your bursting rate actually goes up eventually quicker than the increase in the amount of air you're adding. And so you actually go through a peak in your air recovery. So firstly, just look at what we mean by air recovery and how we measure it. So this also was therefore accompanied by developments that we made in imaging and other experimental techniques. So the first thing we had to do was just measure the velocity of the froth over the lip. And we do this using image analysis. So we put a camera over the edge of the lip, sometimes at multiple points, because in industry, not all flotation cells are put in perfectly level, etc. So quite often when we go onto sites, we find that more air is, or more of the froth is coming over one side or versus the other. But that, I suppose, is a experimental rather than a conceptual issue. And the other thing we need to know is how high the froth is as it overflows the lip. And we do that using laser measurements. We've tried a variety of techniques, but we find that the laser measurements are the easiest and most reliable way of doing it. So overall, we have our small unit, which we can put on the edge of the cell lips and can generate all of this data. So we can measure the air recoveries, air rates, bubble size as well, if we need it. And we can therefore do this everywhere from our sort of lab scale cells all the way up to large industrial cells. So we've done these sorts of studies on a large number of different cells. Well, I say we, people in the group, I tend to not be involved in these studies at the moment. I tend to just get the data afterwards, but doing studies of air recoveries from a large range of different cells. And one of the really interesting things that was noted is that this peak in air recovery tends to correspond to a peak in performance. You get better grade recovery curves as you go through the peak. Typically, what happens when you're below the peak and you increase your air rate into the cell, you keep increasing the recovery. As you go beyond the peak, what typically happens is your recovery levels off, but your grade keeps decreasing. So you end up one of the best grade recovery curves around this peak in air recovery. And therefore, my point here is that the idea of actually investigating air recovery came from the modeling and simulation work. The fact that this peak in air recovery was observed actually came from the subsequent experimental work. So it wasn't, we have used the modeling to try and explain it, but it didn't actually come from the modeling work itself. But the need to study and the importance of this air recovery measurement came from the modeling work in the first place. The next thing we did when it came to the froth phase is try and develop simple relationships. Up till now, I've talked about sort of CFD-like models of the froth phase, and those are very useful because we can start to simulate things like detailed cell geometries, how the particular design of internal components affects the behavior. But the problem with any CFD simulation, whether it's in flotation or any other system, is there are a bit like experiments. You can only get trends out of them by doing a large number of simulations. Same as you can get trends out of a large number of experiments, you can get trends out of a large number of CFD simulations. They don't inherently tell you exactly what those trends should be. Admittedly, knowing something about the models, you might get a bit of a feeling for how it's likely to change, but you don't have a nice analytical expression for your behaviors. So one of the things we wanted to do was to develop simple relationships based on these more complex models that can be used for things like optimization or control. So where instead of having to run a simulation that'll take maybe hours to actually get the result, you can just have an expression which you can instantly solve. Of course, there is still a challenge in this. The whole reason we're doing the CFD problem is because you can't directly get an analytical solution to these systems. They're highly nonlinear. There's no nice analytical expression for the overall behavior. And so you do need to make assumptions when it comes to turning these CFD-like models into analytical expressions. And therefore, the challenge is, of course, to make enough assumptions that you can actually derive an analytical expression without actually losing the key behavior that you're trying to predict. And we think we've done it reasonably successfully in the froth phase. So for instance, here, I'm going to show you the relationship for the water rate. So this is an expression for the water rate. And we've made a few assumptions. We're assuming that the upward gas velocity is roughly constant, moving upwards below the level of the lip, and that we're deeper than the capillary boundary layer at the bottom of the froth. It'll typically be a very non-linear relationship in the first centimeter or two of the froth depth, where capillary forces are really important. But above that, the capillary forces become less important, and you can actually make analytical approximations. And so these are the relationships we get. And again, you'll see that this air recovery alpha is a really key parameter in the amount of water that is being recovered. Air rate, bubble size, and air recovery really determine how much water is going to be pulled out of the froth. And we're actually, independently. So this was studies done at the JK, looking at different water recovery models, and you can see just based on image analysis. So essentially, the input parameters here can be obtained from image analysis. You can get alpha from image analysis. You can get the outflowing bubble size from image analysis, and the JG from other measurements. You can see we get a very good correlation between our models and the water recovery from a flotation cell, which is always very encouraging, considering that these are fundamentally based models. They do have a tuning parameter. They have a single, essentially, tuning parameter in them, but you still get a very good relationship of a single tuning parameter. The other thing that this was useful for is putting together models for doing control. So we can combine our simplified model. So as well as the water model, we also have a model for froth recovery, a model for entrainment factor, all based on the same sort of underlying physics I discussed before, again, with enough assumptions to try and actually make the thing feasible to solve. And putting these together, we can develop a dynamic model for what's happening in a flotation cell. We were testing it at a lab scale cell. And you can see, first of all, this is just showing the, I suppose, open circuit response of our model, comparing the experimental results to our model's predictions of the behavior. And it gives reasonably good predictions over quite a wide range of conditions for what's actually happening. The thing, though, with these models is if we're going to use them for control, particularly for sort of feed-forward model-based control, we don't actually need to have our models be exact. These sorts of analytical expressions are actually very good, because the key factor is, if you're going to use this sort of modeling in a control thing, is it has to go in the correct direction. So we really want to know if we're at a particular set of conditions and we want to move towards another set of conditions, in what direction do we need to change our parameters? And these sorts of analytical models are actually very good for those sorts of behaviors, and are not especially system dependent in terms of needing tuning. So we were the particular model predictive control we were using was something called economic model predictive control. So essentially we're optimizing some objective function. In this case, we were actually optimizing recovery subject to a minimum grade. So essentially, we're setting the grade, the minimum grade the system is allowed to achieve, and trying to maximize recovery subject to that minimum grade. And this is how the system responds. And using this, the models we have there, it modified the air rate in. We were just looking at the air recovery, so it does actually end up increasing the air recovery. And you'll see from the starting condition, actually initially in its search, its grade goes the wrong way, but eventually it gets to a grade that is effectively our set point grade, and in the process increases the overall recovery reasonably significantly in this system. So that's the froth phase. After doing a lot of work in the froth phase, we did come to realize we did need to have improved models for predicting our pulp zone behavior, predictions of the pulp zone behavior. And what we developed to doing that is an SPH-DEM simulator. So SPH is smooth particle hydrodynamics. It's a meshless method for solving fluid flow problems. You're essentially using a smoothing function to turn a set of discrete values into continuous values. And as soon as you've got continuous values, you can differentiate them, etc., and therefore use them as the basis for a discretization of pretty much any equation. So with something like smooth particle hydrodynamics, you're directly solving the Navier-Stokes equation or any other equation you would like to solve. At the same time, I also implemented a discrete element method within it, and these go naturally together because they're both Lagrangian. So two Lagrangian systems working together work well. And I also deliberately implemented it to run in parallel. So I can run this on my PC. So the code is written to be a very standard. I can compile it under Windows, Linux, Macs if you really want to. So it can be compiled pretty much under anything, but it can therefore also run on high performance computing clusters. So I've run simulations on my PC, but I've also run it typically in a few hundred cores is my sort of standard run, but I've also tested my code on a few thousand cores, and it scales very well. This means we can tackle large multi-phase problems with free surfaces, and including a lot of the sort of rheology and behavior that you actually need to do to understand, well, not just flotation, but also a lot of other minerals processing problems. So I've done a reasonable amount of studies using this simulator. Some of the earliest ones I did was actually trying to understand things like bubble breakup around an impeller. So this is a very high resolution simulation, simulating directly, including surface tension, how bubbles break up around an impeller. The problem with this sort of simulation is we are pretty much restricted to lab scale cells, and that's because the size of the bubbles in a lab scale cell, flotation cell, is about the same as the size of the bubbles in an industrial scale cell, which means that while we can feasibly put in enough resolution to simulate 0.5 millimeter bubbles like we are here, you can't put in anywhere near enough resolution into an industrial scale cell, also including, say, 0.5 millimeter bubbles. We then also looked at doing it rather than directly simulating every single bubble shape and surface tension, doing it using a coupled SPH-DEM approach. So in this approach, we're looking at the simulation of sort of fluidized bed flotation cells, but only looking at a small sub-volume. So this sub-volume is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And we're now treating our particles and our bubbles as DEM objects. Admittedly, the bubbles as very soft DEM objects and the particles as hard DEM objects, as well as having a fluid in there as well, so well as having the water, which is two-way coupled, so affecting the solids and being affected by the solids. And on top of that, we added an attachment model. So this is looking at different induction times. So essentially, how long does a floatable particle and a bubble need to be in contact with one another before they actually attach? And in this case, they form clusters. So you don't just have one bubble and one particle. You actually end up with multiple bubbles and multiple particles all being stuck together because it is a comparatively quiescent system. So if you move to a conventional flotation cell, those clusters would tend to get broken up. But in these relatively quiescent fluidized bed type flotation cells, they aren't. The problem with all of those, though, is that you are limited to maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe a million air bubbles or particles. But if you're moving to a proper sized flotation cell, there are many orders of magnitude more bubbles and particles than you can actually simulate in that way. So recently, I've actually come up with a new formulation for the SPH system, where we actually treat the bubbles and particles as concentrations, and so do it using something that is in some sense similar to the Eulerian approach that is used in sort of traditional fluid dynamics, but we're doing it essentially as a semi-Lagrangian approach. So we still have a moving reference frame. So we have a reference frame that's moving at an averaged velocity. It's not moving at either the bubble's velocity or the particles or the liquid's velocity. It's moving at some averaged velocity between those. And then we have equations for the velocity of each of those phases relative to that reference frame. And you might think, how is that different to the Eulerian approach? Well, the really big difference is it leads to much less numerical diffusion. In an Eulerian approach, the usual issue is you get everything, all your concentration fields badly smeared out. And that's because if you're simulating something like flotation, you've got liquid moving very fast, you've got particles moving very fast, but the relative velocity between your particles and liquid is very small. And so if you've got too high velocities and your dispersion depends on the relative velocity between them, you've now got big errors in this relative velocity. Whereas now in this simulation framework, I'm simulating the relative velocity to the reference frame. So these relative velocities are quite small, and the reference frame's motion is quite large. And so you actually get much less numerical dispersion than you would get in a traditional approach. I'm not going to go into the equations. This is just showing the sets of partial differential equations you end up having to solve for each of the phases. Just pointing out we have things like drag, added mass, lift, effects in our interface forces. We also have a granular temperature, which means we can handle high solids contents without having any issues. And for the flotation-specific system, we also include attachment and detachment from the bubbles. So this is just showing our same lab scale cell. So this is one of our earlier lab scale cell designs where we're actually feeding the air in from the bottom. And this is just showing how it handles the solids, overall solids content and the air holdup. You can see the behavior is plausible. We have done comparisons to things like PEPT, etc., which I'll be mentioning later, but I'm not going to go into a lot of the validation, but it does produce reasonably good results for what's actually happening in one of these cells. And as I said, we also do the attachment and detachment processes. So these are just showing, well, in two different ways, how much particles are actually attached to bubbles. Left-hand one is effectively a grade, and the right-hand one is a local recovery type measurement. The other nice thing here is we can actually use it to start to test designs, etc. So one of my colleagues, Diego Messer, is testing the impact of different inserts into the cell on the performance. And the nice thing is these simulators can take in the same CAD files that he is using for actually 3D printing these inserts. The inserts are 3D printed and put into our standard cell design. And we can do the same simulations as the experiments that are doing and start to, well, first of all, get validation for the modeling, but also start to get an understanding of why the cells are behaving as they are with different types of inserts in them. And ultimately, we also do PEPT experiments, which I'll get onto in a bit, to try to validate these behaviors and understand what is actually happening experimentally as well. So this is showing, we do it with multiple sized particles and bubbles. So this is just showing our predictions of bubble size and particle size as a function of position in the cell. We've also been doing it for the fluidized bed flotation cells. And actually, one of the things we were worried about with these fluidized bed flotation cell lab scale experiments is that actually the startup behavior would influence our overall results. And so here we didn't just start it from a filled cell, we actually simulated the entire startup process as well as the overall behavior. And that's because we can still handle free surfaces. So we can handle a system which has liquid flowing into it and mixing, etc., and then ultimately heading towards sort of steady state behavior. And once we had gained the sort of confidence at the lab scale, we could move on to industrial scale simulations. So this is, I have to remember the size, I think it's a 1 cubic meter or maybe 2. I think this one actually might be the 3 cubic meter cell. Anyway, we were simulating them at a variety of different scales. And here you can see the left-hand side is the attached particles, so showing the flotation effect. Middle one is the unattached valuable particles, and the right-hand side one is the gang particles in this system. So we can simulate from the small scale up to the sort of large scale behavior in these systems. I've already mentioned PEPT before. So for those of you who don't know it, PEPT is positron emission particle tracking. Uses the same scanner that, it uses the same scanner that is used in PET scanning, so for medical positron emission tomography. But instead of tracking average concentrations, in PET, you're tracking the location of an individual particle. So this technique was first developed in Birmingham. I suppose our group's main contribution in this area is working on two things. First of all, how do you actually use the data that you're generating from this PET measurements, and improving the tracers that we're actually using to do the measurements. So as I said, PEPT, you're tracking the motion of a single particle in an otherwise normal flotation system, admittedly normal lab scale flotation system. So you can see on the middle one here is these are the tracks of the individual particles. But what you can do with those tracks is if you do enough experiments, you can actually start to do appropriate averaging to actually get the flow behavior, flow loops, the velocities, etc., of your tracer as a function of position. And this becomes far more useful, as you can probably immediately gather, in terms of actually trying to compare with what is happening in a simulation of these cells. We've also been working on PEPT tracers. So what we really want to be able to do is not just follow one type of particle, but be able to work on how different types of particles behave in the system. So there's a variety of different ways of actually doing it. And the ways that we've been doing this has been in conjunction with University of Cape Town, is looking at different types of resins where you can impregnate the resins with gallium-68 to produce the positrons, which then annihilate to give you your gamma ray signals. But because of the resins, we can change the properties of the resins and the coatings of the resins to actually give them different properties. So we're doing it with 3 different types of tracers: a hydrophobic tracer, a hydrophilic tracer, and a neutrally buoyant tracer. So the 2 left-hand ones behave like your hydrophobic and hydrophilic particles, and your neutrally buoyant one behaves more like the liquid in the system. So you can start to tell where different types of particles as well as your liquid go, and therefore start to tell a difference between them here. So this is showing some of these afterwards averaged velocity profiles to show you where your particles go, for instance, relative to where the liquid goes. So to start to see where they're similar, where they're different, to really get an understanding for what's happening in these cells. So, as I said, that is where my modeling all started. So it was all starting in looking at flotation. But the modeling I have done is a relatively generic SPH-DEM coupled code. So I wrote it so that I could do flotation, but it is generally applicable. And if anything, it's probably more applicable to some of the comminution systems than it is to flotation, because we can automatically do things like charge slurry interactions, and we're doing it in a single simulator. So this isn't 2 simulators speaking to one another. My simulator is one simulator where everything's done in the same framework. And you can do proper solid fluid coupling. And actually my code allows 2 different ways of doing solid fluid coupling. One is direct simulation of the interaction. And in this case, you essentially have if you're thinking of a charged particle, which is acting as a moving boundary condition. So you're still getting the fluid forces onto it, and the fluid is exerting forces by the fact that it's actually a boundary condition that is moving. The disadvantage of this process, of this way of doing, is that it's computationally very, very expensive. And that's because you need a much higher fluid resolution than the size of your individual particles in the media, because you need to be able to model the fluid flow around every single individual particle. And from the advantage, though, is you don't need to actually know any relationships for drag, lift, etc. They're emergent properties. You know, the fluid flow around your particle gives you drag. You don't need to give it a drag relationship. The other way of doing these simulations is to parameterize your interactions and essentially have it as, or you might think as an immersed body. So your fluid and your particles overlap in some sense, and you're doing your interactions, your 2-way coupling via relationships. So you need to know a relationship between the particle properties, the relative velocity, to give you a drag force between them, and the same for things like lift forces, etc. This, though, is computationally much, much cheaper than a direct simulation, because you can have a fluid resolution that is where the actual size of your resolution is much larger than the size of your media particles. So a much lower resolution than the media particles resolution. And so you don't need to put in actually much more computational cost than just doing a pure DEM simulation in these cases. So this is showing a simulation where we're doing the direct simulation, whereas more correctly, the right-hand side is the direct simulation. The left-hand side is a pure DEM simulation. So this is a slice through a mill. And if you're looking at the left-hand simulation, I did on my desktop machine. It took a few hours on my desktop machine to do that simulation. The right-hand one with the fluid, there's about 1.5 orders of magnitude more fluid particles in there than there are the DEM objects. And that took a few days on a few hundred cores on a high-performance computing cluster. So it computationally dramatically more expensive than doing the pure DEM simulation in this case. Oops, not sure why these aren't starting. Come on. So these are showing the simulations using the simple drag relationship, both for stirred mills. And here the advantage is these are comparatively cheap computationally. Both these simulations were run on a desktop machine, so you can do them pretty low cost. Two different ways of stirring your media, but all relatively low cost simulations. Oops, oh, come on. Sorry. There we go. So I suppose the first simulations I did were more, I suppose, proof of concept, if you want to think of it that way. But my first proper foray into doing these sorts of simulations was with Aubrey and Divine Sabunya, who's a well, should be in the audience, but is a PhD student at UCT who is just about to graduate now. And she was looking at using these simulations to investigate stirred mills, looking at things like the size of the mill and how it affects the behavior. Oops, that, as well as the media shape. So the simulator that I've written supports a variety of different shaped particles. So you can have simple geometric objects like spheres or cylinders. You can have polygonal shapes, so triangulated meshes, or a combination of objects. So you could, for instance, do a particle which is a combination of spheres, where those spheres move together as a rigid body. But Divine has extended the simulator to be able to do superquadric shapes. So these are parameterized shapes that are between a sphere and a cuboid. And of course, the advantage here is it's computationally much cheaper than trying to represent these sorts of shapes using a meshed surface. If you want to do a mesh surface for one of these shapes, the code will be relatively slow, whereas it's much quicker when using these sorts of shapes. And what she was investigating with it was this effect of the cell size and media shape on the performance of these stirred mills, so velocities, occupancies, etc. So that was one of the investigations that were carrying out. Another person I've been working with in terms of mill simulations is Douglas Nzingi from UFMG. And there, what he had noted in his experiments was that when you did a mixture of ceramic balls and steel balls in a tumbling mill, he was getting better performance than either of those two on their own. So he was getting equivalent sized particle sizes coming out at much lower energies when you were doing a mixture of ceramic balls and steel balls. And the idea here was actually to do some simulations to try and understand what is happening in these systems and why they are different. So again, doing these sorts of simulations and with different mixtures of the media and the slurry. So this includes a slurry in the simulations as well. So just showing the two different types of particles and the relative proportions. And we were looking at the distributions of the collision energies in the system as a way of trying to understand what is actually happening. And I suppose the main trend we noticed is that as you increase the proportion of ceramic balls, the amount of energy being dissipated in very high energy collisions drops, and the amount being dissipated in lower energy collisions goes up. That's sort of as you would expect. And our surmising here is that we're hitting some sort of, I suppose, Goldilocks region where you're not wasting as much energy at the two ends. So very high energy collisions are likely to waste some of the energy in them. Very low energy collisions are likely to waste energy as well. And we're probably thinking that we're adding more of our energy into the region where more breakage will actually be occurring. And just showing we can also, from these simulations, extract both components of the collision energy, so both the normal dissipation and the shear dissipation. So that's just to give you a bit of feel for the sort of heap leaching. I'm now going to very rapidly go through some of the other sorts of modeling I have done using the simulations. And one of the big areas we work in is heap leaching. And this actually, again, started from doing these sorts of SPH simulations, trying to understand what is happening at sort of particle scale, and where you go from something that is very capillary dominated to something which is far more gravity dominated as your particle size changes. But we did also then start to link this again with the sort of experimental results we needed to actually understand the system. And what we're using here was XMT, so X-ray microtomography. And what we were able to do is track our leaching over multiple weeks. So we tracked it for, I think these ones are tracked for 168 days. So what's that, 4 months or so. And we were able to track the leaching of every single individual grain. So we were tracking the leaching of millions of sulfide grains within each of the particles. So we could really understand the sort of particle scale kinetics in the system. We then combined this to produce improved models. So usually people just use sort of shrinking core or similar models for the leaching behavior. And we were trying to develop improved particle scale leach models for what, if you do a CT scan of a particle, how is it going to leach? So we're using the experimental data as our input for the leach kinetic distribution, and then simulating the behavior within that particle. Again, using it to predict long-term leach trends, but also using it as the input again for a heap leach scale simulator. So this is not an SPH simulator. This is a completely separate finite element-based simulator that we developed in the department. But again, it's the sort of combination of doing experiments and then doing simulations to go with them, either before or afterwards. This one, we actually did the experiments first and the simulations afterwards, rather than the opposite way with most of the other simulations we've been showing. I've also ended up working on all sorts of strange other things, mainly because I have a simulator, and so and I also work in a department which is a general earth science department. So we have lots of people investigating all sorts of things. So I've done my simulations for all sorts of different things. So I've had working with a PhD student and another colleague looking at landslide generated tsunamis. So either where there's a landslide, for instance, into a lake, or there's a submarine landslide, which will generate a tsunami. And so we're predicting the behavior. Left-hand one is a lab scale experiment that we're using for validation, but then the right-hand ones are showing, I suppose, the real scale simulations of this process. A more recent one, where in our department we have a number of people interested in wind power, and if you're going into deeper water, you need to do you want to have floating wind turbines which are tethered to the bottom. So we're looking at simulating the behavior of tethered barges or any other thing. This is just sort of a proof of concept simulation. So it's an MSc student busy doing this project on the behavior of floating barges. I also do solid mechanics, so this is slope stability, slope failure, etc. It's all in the same framework, so the same SPH code can do fluid mechanics and solid mechanics. And I'm also looking at, actually with some colleagues in Spain, looking at mesh barriers. The left-hand one is mesh barrier for stopping debris flow in a channel, and the right-hand one is for those sorts of barriers which stop boulders flattening cars. So this is essentially solid mechanics DEM simulations. The cables are done as elastic plastic bodies, and looking at how they deform and move in response to being hit by these boulders. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of my talk. So hopefully I have shown you that the sort of mechanistic modeling can have a valuable place in minerals processing, and that we can start to simulate these sorts of systems, especially given the sort of computational resources that are available out there. So if you can develop a code that is able to exploit these sorts of computational resources, parallel, so that it can run on hundreds, thousands of cores, you can tackle really large, really complicated problems. But I suppose the other key thing I was hoping to get across is that it's not just the simulations that are important, but also the measurements that go with them. The fact that this sort of modeling tells you the sort of things you actually do need to measure. So it helps you to decide on what new measurement techniques you would like, but also developing the sort of techniques that help you validate these can be valuable in their own right. Okay, so that's the end of what I was going to speak to you. So welcome any questions or comments that anyone has.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure we all benefited looking at how these computational tools can be very useful indeed. We have time for a few questions.
Stop sharing so I can actually see people.
Yeah. Questions? Okay, I'll ask the first question as the chair. Stephen, you did a comparison of what a typical DEM simulation would do, DEM SPH simulation would do in comparison to what you have developed. Is there any penalty if you go to very fine particles in your?
Okay, so in always the disadvantage of going to finer particles with DEM is that your time step gets smaller. So the time step is automatically smaller. In my modeling, it's actually more complicated because I use a non-linear contact model. So even knowing what the stable time step is a little bit complicated. So you have to be slightly conservative in doing it. So yes, time stepping is an issue. Admittedly, my code partly gets around that by doing subcycling. So in my code, the DEM requires typically smaller time steps for stability than the SPH. So my code will do multiple DEM time steps for each SPH time step. So I'll do a whole lot of DEM time steps, then an SPH time steps. Admittedly, what that really means is, especially for those overlapping simulations, the ones we're using drag relationships, etc., for a lot of cases, the SPH DEM is essentially the same cost as the as the pure DEM, because the DEM, especially if you're doing a dense system like a stirred mill, etc., it's the DEM which is what's determining your computational cost rather than the SPH.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question as ever. Malcolm, yeah. Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
When you develop those tools, and I'm actually interested in the particle separation, like flotation or any kind of particle separation system, you could look at redesigning existing equipment.
Yep.
So if I'm to say it's all as inefficient as can be, have you gone into the arena of, well, I've got these tools, how would I design an ideal separator? Have you gone down that pathway?
Not fully yet, and we have actually, I suppose, in our department, people are looking at those sorts of ideas. You know, getting the what do you call it, the automatic differentiation, so you can actually get, you know, if you have a design, how do you actually make it better? What is the direction for going better, to sort of doing automatic optimization of, you know, cell shape, cell design, etc. Admittedly, that doesn't lead you to a radically different design. That leads you to a better design of something which you've already got. I suppose my view on this is it doesn't really replace the human ingenuity. It just makes testing your ideas a whole lot easier than it would be rather than having to actually build something, etc. If you have a simulator which you have reasonable confidence in, and it's this sort of simulator which is, you know, mechanistic, you can have a reasonable confidence that if it shows you do a new design and it gives a better result than your existing design, that difference is real.
Yeah, it can do. You can. I was also thinking, if you understand the sub processes that contribute to the best performance of contact and separation, you'd say, well, if I want to achieve that, what are the things? And you have to dream them up, like you said. The simulator doesn't give it to you. You dream up methods to do it, and you could use the simulator to look at the feasibility. Don't worry about the engineering or building it. Does it show that kind of benefit? So that's what I'm thinking, these experimental building from the bottom up, because I think that's why as an industry we should be going, is what are fundamentally the best way to achieve an objective? Use these tools to build this theoretical machine. That could move us to a completely different mode. I think that's where my interest lies now.
Yeah, well, I think that's very definitely true with these sorts of simulators. You know, I was concentrating on what you need to know to go into the simulator as being the key in this one. But, you know, anything that gains you a better understanding of what's really happening in these systems, rather than just treating them as a black box, I think is a good thing. You know, these empirical models have their place, because typically for a particular system, they'll get the numbers correct better than a mechanistic model, where there'll always be something you haven't quite included, but they don't really tell you anything directly about how the system is working and what's really the dominant mechanisms in there. And, you know, these sorts of models do.
But like any of these, you've got to do your time.
Yep.
You've got to start with existing systems and really get to understand them before you can move on to something novel. Anyway, thank you very much. Great.
No problem.
Thank you, Malcolm. Any other questions for Stephen? We can squeeze in one more. We know we are running late. Okay, one more. Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a very good presentation, and I think it speaks to comminution more than flotation, because our business is to supply particles for downstream. So we need to know what is happening downstream for us to do our business well. And that was very good. Thank you. We look forward to you presenting again in future when an opportunity arises. Thank you very much.
And hopefully we'll have some more comminution things to show at that point. So
thank you. And thank you for presenting today.
No problem.
Cheers. Oh, thank you very much. We'll meet again in next month for another seminar. Tulio will announce the next speaker for next month in due course. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
You.